The rain had already ruined the hem of her gown, but Eleanor Ashworth had stopped caring about her gowns years ago. She stood at the edge of the ballroom at Faircross Hall, half hidden behind a column draped in ivy, watching her sister Lavinia spin through the candlelight like something poured from gold. Every eye in the room followed Lavinia. No one's eyes followed Eleanor. That was, her mother often reminded her, simply the natural order of things. Some daughters were born to be admired, and others were born to be useful. Stand up straighter, Eleanor, smile, for heaven's sake. You look as though you are attending a funeral rather than a ball. Lady Ashworth did not even glance at her as she spoke, her gaze fixed instead on the doorway, waiting for the arrival that the entire county had been whispering about for a week. The Earl of Ravenscliff will be here within the hour. I will not have you standing in the corner like a governess. I was not aware corners required permission to be occupied. Mother, do not be clever. Cleverness is not becoming in a woman who cannot also be beautiful. It was said so plainly, so without cruelty intended, which was somehow worse than cruelty, that Eleanor simply nodded and said nothing at all. She had learnt long ago that arguing with her mother was like arguing with weather. It did not change the outcome. It only left her tired. She was 24, unmarried, and considered by everyone in Hartwell Village to be the sensible Ashworth daughter, which was a polite way of saying the plain one. Lavinia, 2 years her junior, was the beautiful one, the charming one, the one whose portrait their father had commissioned twice, because he could not choose which likeness flattered her more. No one had ever asked to paint Eleanor. She did not resent her sister for this, not truly. Lavinia had not chosen her own face any more than Eleanor had chosen hers. What Eleanor resented, quietly and without permitting herself the indulgence of saying it aloud, was the particular exhaustion of being needed and never wanted. She kept her father's ledgers because Lavinia could not add a column of figures without weeping from the strain of it. She nursed the tenants' children through fever because Lavinia could not bear the smell of a sick room. She had, in the 11 years since their mother's health had begun its slow decline, become the true mistress of Ashworth House in every practical sense, and remained. In every social sense, invisible, she was still turning that thought over when the doors of the ballroom opened, and the Earl of Ravenscliff walked in, and the entire room seemed to draw one collective breath. He was younger than she had expected, not much past 30, and there was nothing soft in his face. He moved through the crowd the way a man moves through a room he has already decided he does not wish to be in, his expression courteous and utterly closed, as though every smile he offered cost him something he did not care to spend. Eleanor watched the way the young ladies arranged themselves like flowers turning toward the sun, and she watched Lavinia glide forward with practiced grace, and she felt, not for the first time, grateful to be standing where no one expected anything of her. She did not know, as she slipped quietly out through the terrace doors into the cool evening air, that the Earl's grey eyes had followed her retreat for exactly as long as it took her to disappear from view. She did not know it, because she never looked back to see it. The garden at Faircross Hall was empty and smelled of wet stone and late roses, and Eleanor breathed it in like a woman surfacing from water. She was not made for ballrooms. She had known this since she was 16 years old, and had overheard a matron remark to another that the elder Ashworth girl had a fine mind wasted on a face God had forgotten to finish. She had cried about it once, in private, and never again. Tears were also, she had decided, a waste of something better spent elsewhere. It was on her walk home an hour later, for the Ashworth carriage had been given over entirely to Lavinia and their mother, who intended to stay until the last dance, that Eleanor first saw him. He was seated at the edge of the lane where the road forked toward the old chapel, half collapsed against the trunk of a bent oak, and for a moment she thought he was simply a beggar sleeping off drink, the way men sometimes did on market nights. But something in the stillness of him made her slow her steps. His coat, what remained of it, had once been fine. She could see it even in the dark, the ghost of good tailoring beneath years of wear. His hands, folded loosely in his lap, were not the hands of a labourer. "Sir?" She crouched at a careful distance, the way one approaches an animal that might startle. "Sir? Are you unwell?" He did not answer at first. When he finally lifted his head, she saw that his eyes were clouded with fever, his lips cracked, his whole body trembling faintly beneath the thin coat. He looked at her as though she was something he could not quite place, a memory perhaps, or a dream he was not certain he was having. "I am only resting," he said, and his voice, though rough with illness, carried an unmistakable note of breeding, the vowels shaped by a kind of education that did not belong on a man in rags at the side of a country lane. "You needn't trouble yourself. You are burning with fever," Eleanor said. "You cannot stay here. The night will kill you. Would that be so great a loss?" It was not self-pity in his voice. It was simple, flat exhaustion, the voice of a man who had said such things to himself so many times that they no longer carried weight. Eleanor felt something twist beneath her ribs, not pity exactly, though there was pity in it, but something closer to recognition. She knew what it was to be considered a thing of no consequence. She did not know why a gentleman, for she was now certain that was what he had once been, should feel the same, but she knew the particular hollowness in a person's eyes when they had stopped expecting kindness, and she could not walk past it. "It would be a loss to me," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice, "for I have just found you, and I do not intend to lose what I have only just found." She helped him to his feet. He was lighter than his frame suggested, wasted by hunger, and half carried, half guided him the quarter-mile to the old gardener's cottage that sat empty at the far edge of the Ashworth property, unused since the last gardener had died 2 winters past. It had a hearth, a narrow bed, and a door that locked, and it was, crucially, far enough from the main house that her mother would never think to look there. She told herself, as she built the fire and boiled water for tea and tore strips from an old petticoat to bind the raw sore on his ankle, that she was simply doing what any Christian soul would do. She did not examine too closely why her heart was beating as though she had run the whole way home. "What is your name?" she asked, once he was settled beneath the thin blanket she had found in the cottage's single chest, his fever beginning, faintly to ease under the warmth. He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the low fire, and when he spoke, his voice had gone strange and distant. "I do not entirely remember," he said. "There was a fall. A long time ago. Some things came loose in my head and did not find their way back. Surely you remember something. A place. A person." "I remember," he said slowly, "that I once had a son, and I remember that I failed him so completely that I could not bear to let him see what I had become. So I let him believe I was dead, and I let myself become no one at all, and I have been no one for a great many years now." He turned his cloudy eyes toward her, and there was something in them so raw, so unguarded, that Eleanor's throat tightened. "You are the first person in longer than I can say who has looked at me and seen a man, rather than a nuisance to be stepped around." "Then I am glad I was walking that road tonight," Eleanor said quietly, "instead of riding home in a carriage like a sensible person." For the first time, something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched his cracked lips. "What is your name, child?" "Eleanor. Eleanor Ashworth." "Eleanor," he repeated, as though testing the shape of it. "Thank you, Eleanor Ashworth. I had forgotten that kindness of this particular sort still existed in the world." She told no one. Not her mother, who would have been horrified at the scandal of harboring a strange man on the property. Not her father, who was too consumed these days with the mounting weight of debts he thought no one in the family knew about. Not even Lavinia, who would have found the whole matter either alarming or, worse, amusing. Instead, twice each day, Eleanor slipped away from the house with bread wrapped in cloth, with broth carried carefully in a covered jar, with clean linens, and once, with a battered volume of poetry she had found in the library, that she thought might comfort a mind clinging to whatever fragments remained of a better life. She called him, for lack of any name he could offer her, simply Sir, and then, as the days passed and the fever slowly broke and something like trust grew quietly between them in the small stone cottage, she began to call him something gentler, old friend, or, when he was particularly low in spirit, dear heart, the way she might have spoken to her own father had her own father ever permitted such tenderness. She did not know that less than 3 miles away, in the fine guest chambers of Faircross Hall, the Earl of Ravenscliff lay awake each night, turning over the same unanswered question that had haunted him for 10 years, where his father had gone. The night the old Earl walked out of Ravenscliff Park and never returned, and whether the man who had once taught him to ride and to read and to love, before grief and ruin had hollowed him into something else, was alive anywhere in the world at all. She would learn it soon enough. But not yet. The days that followed took on a quiet rhythm that Eleanor found herself treasuring more than she dared admit. Each morning she rose before the rest of the household, dressed simply, and carried what provisions she could spare down the overgrown path to the gardener's cottage, where the old man, for so she had come to think of him, though there was a dignity to him that made the word feel both too plain and exactly right, waited with the particular patience of someone who had learned, through long suffering, not to expect too much from any single day. His strength returned slowly. The fever broke fully on the 4th day, though his body remained thin and his hands still trembled when he lifted a cup. But his mind, which had seemed so clouded on that first rain-soaked night, sharpened with each passing day, and Eleanor began to see, in fragments, the man he must once have been. He spoke, when he spoke at all of the past, in careful half-sentences, as though feeling his way across a floor he did not trust to hold his weight. A great house, he said once. A wife he had loved beyond sense, and lost too young. A son who had grown from a boy into a man Eleanor gathered he was fiercely, painfully proud of, even as guilt strangled every mention of him. "Why did you leave him?" Eleanor asked one evening as she mended the sleeve of his coat by the low firelight. "If you loved him so well." The old man was quiet for a long time. "Because I had failed him in a way I could not undo," he said finally. "There was a scandal, money that vanished that should not have vanished, and blame that fell, unfairly, upon our name, and I was too proud and too broken by grief to fight it properly. I told myself I was protecting him by disappearing, that a dead father was easier to bear than a disgraced one. I told myself many things in those first terrible months. I am no longer certain any of them were true." He looked at her, and there was something almost pleading in his expression, as though he needed her, a stranger, to grant him an absolution he could not grant himself. A man convinces himself of a great many comforting lies when the truth is too heavy to carry. "He may have needed you more broken than absent," Eleanor said softly. "Grief shared is not always grief doubled. Sometimes it is grief halved." "You speak as one who has carried grief of her own." "I have carried a great many things," Eleanor said, and did not elaborate, and he did not press her, and something in that mutual restraint, that willingness to let the other keep their sorrows private until they were ready to be spoken, became, without either of them naming it, a kind of intimacy neither had known in a long while. It was on one such evening, 3 weeks into this quiet secret arrangement, that Eleanor first encountered the Earl of Ravenscliff face to face. She had gone to the village apothecary to purchase a tincture for the old man's persistent cough, her basket over her arm, her bonnet doing little to shield her from the thin autumn drizzle, when she rounded the corner of Hartwell's narrow High Street directly into a gentleman emerging from the coaching inn. She stumbled, he caught her elbow before she could fall, and she looked up to find herself staring into a pair of grey eyes she recognized instantly from the ballroom 3 weeks prior. "Forgive me," she said, straightening quickly, painfully aware of her plain wool cloak and rain-damp hem beside his immaculate greatcoat. "I was not attending to where I walked." The fault was equally mine. He did not release her arm immediately, and there was something in the way he studied her, not the polite, dismissive glance she was accustomed to receiving from gentlemen of his rank, but a genuine, searching attention that made her cheeks warm despite herself. "I believe we were both present at Faircross Hall some weeks past, though I confess I do not recall being introduced." "I doubt you would, my lord. I spent a great deal of that evening in the garden." Something flickered across his face, amusement perhaps, or recognition, the lady who vanished through the terrace doors. I noticed. Eleanor blinked, startled. I cannot think why you would have noticed anything so unremarkable. Can you not? He said it quietly, almost to himself, and then seemed to catch himself, straightening with the faint, practiced formality of a man recalling his own rank. Forgive me. I am Julian Hartley, Earl of Ravenscliff. Eleanor Ashworth. She offered the smallest curtsy the situation demanded, unwilling to appear as though she were courting his attention the way she had watched every other unmarried woman in the county attempt to do since his arrival. I am afraid I must continue on, my lord. I have a sick friend waiting on this tincture. A sick friend, he repeated, and something in his tone sharpened with a curiosity he seemed almost surprised by himself. In the village? Not precisely. She hesitated, unwilling to lie outright, but equally unwilling to explain the truth of the gardener's cottage to a man she had known for the space of 4 minutes. It is a private matter, my lord. He studied her a moment longer, and she had the peculiar sensation of being seen, truly seen, in a manner that felt both uncomfortable and treacherously rather wonderful, before he inclined his head. Then I will not press you, Miss Ashworth. Though I confess myself curious, it is not every day one encounters a lady who prefers gardens to ballrooms and tinctures to trinkets. Most ladies would say that reflects poorly on my sense, my lord, not favourably on my character. Most ladies, he said, with the faintest, almost reluctant curve of his mouth, are wrong about a great many things. He bowed and took his leave, and Eleanor stood in the thin rain for a full minute after he had gone, trying to understand why her heart was behaving as though she had just run the length of Hartwell High Street, when in truth she had done nothing more than stand still and be looked at by a stranger. She did not tell the old man about the encounter when she returned to the cottage that evening. She told herself it was because the matter was too trivial to mention. She did not examine too closely why, when she lay in her narrow bed that night, it was not the old man's grateful smile that lingered in her mind, but a pair of grey eyes that had looked at her as though she were worth noticing. She would have been considerably more troubled by that thought had she known the connection between the two men slumbering, unaware of each other, less than 3 miles apart. It was Lady Ashworth who, 2 days later, delivered the news that set the whole household into a fever of its own. A fever considerably more welcome, in her ladyship's estimation, than the one Eleanor had spent 3 weeks quietly nursing in secret. "The Earl has requested to call upon us," Lady Ashworth announced at breakfast, practically vibrating with satisfaction as she waved the calling card as though it were a royal summons. "Formally, Thursday next. Lavinia, you must wear the blue muslin. It does wonders for your complexion. And Eleanor, you will see that the drawing-room is properly arranged, and that cook prepares something suitably impressive, though not so impressive as to appear as though we are trying too hard, which we are, of course, trying very hard, but a lady of quality never allows it to show. Why should the Earl call upon us at all?" Eleanor asked, Though she suspected, she already knew the answer, and something in her chest tightened unpleasantly at the thought of it. Why, to court your sister, obviously. Lady Ashworth said it as though the question itself were faintly ridiculous. He danced with her twice at the Faircross ball, and Mrs. Pemberton tells me he inquired most particularly about our family afterward. An earl? Eleanor, do you understand what this could mean for us? Your father's debts. She stopped herself abruptly, though the words had already escaped, and busied herself with her tea in a manner that told Eleanor the matter was more dire than she had previously understood. Eleanor understood the arithmetic of it well enough without her mother finishing the sentence. Sir Edmund Ashworth's debts had been mounting for years. Poor harvests, worse investments, a gentleman's pride that would not permit economies suited to their actual circumstances, and a match between Lavinia and an Earl of Ravenscliff's considerable fortune would solve, in one stroke, a problem that had been quietly suffocating the family for a decade. She should have felt relief at the prospect. Instead, she felt something cold and unwelcome settle beneath her ribs, and she despised herself for it, because it had absolutely nothing to do with her father's finances and everything to do with a pair of grey eyes and a voice that had told her most ladies were wrong about a great many things. Of course, she said quietly. I will see to the drawing room. Thursday arrived with all the ceremony Lady Ashworth's anxious planning could muster. Lavinia, resplendent in blue muslin, was seated in the best light the drawing-room afforded, her golden curls arranged with careful artlessness, her laugh a genuinely lovely sound. Eleanor had always privately thought, even amid her jealousy, pitched perfectly to carry across the room without seeming to try. Eleanor, in her plainest grey, had been assigned the task of pouring tea and remaining, as her mother put it with unconscious cruelty, sensible in the background, where you are most comfortable. The Earl arrived precisely on time, and Eleanor watched from behind the tea service as her mother fluttered him toward the seat beside Lavinia, as her father made stiff, anxious conversation about the weather and the harvest, as Lavinia laughed her lovely laugh at every remark the Earl made, whether or not it merited laughter, and she watched with a confusion that bordered on painful as Julian Hartley's grey eyes drifted, again and again, away from the golden vision seated so carefully beside him, and toward the plain, grey-clad woman pouring tea in the corner of the room. Miss Ashworth. He said it during a lull in Lavinia's chatter, and it took Eleanor a moment to realize he was addressing her and not her sister, for no one had addressed her directly in this drawing-room in longer than she could recall. I understand you manage a great deal of your father's household affairs. Lady Ashworth's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Eleanor has a head for figures, my lord. It is true, though it is hardly a fitting subject for. I find it a very fitting subject, the Earl said, mild but unmistakably final, and something in his tone brooked no further redirection. I confess I have little patience for conversation that skims only the surface of a person, Lady Ashworth. Tell me, Miss Ashworth, do you find the work satisfying? Eleanor set down the teapot, aware of every eye in the room upon her, aware of her sister's faint, puzzled frown, aware of her mother's rigid displeasure. "I find it necessary, my lord, which is not always the same as satisfying. But there is a certain honesty to numbers that I have come to value. They do not flatter, they do not deceive, they simply are what they are, and one may build something solid upon that certainty." Something shifted in the Earl's expression, a flicker of genuine interest, quick and unguarded, gone almost as soon as it appeared. "A philosophy I find myself in considerable sympathy with," he said quietly. "There is a great deal of flattery in the world, Miss Ashworth, and precious little honesty. I find I have grown rather tired of the former." Lavinia, sensing the conversation drifting somewhere she could not follow, laughed brightly and redirected the Earl's attention toward a discussion of the upcoming county assembly. And the moment passed, and the visit continued, and by its conclusion, Lady Ashworth was already congratulating herself on a match all but secured. But Eleanor, gathering the tea things afterward with hands that were not entirely steady, could not stop replaying the particular quality of the Earl's attention. The way he had looked at her, not as a plain sister to be politely overlooked, but as a person whose answer he genuinely wished to hear. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself this 3 more times before she managed, mostly, to believe it. The old man's health, meanwhile, had improved enough that he had begun, on the mildest afternoons, to sit outside the cottage door, in a chair Eleanor had carried down from the attic, watching the light move through the trees with an expression of quiet, aching gratitude that never failed to move her. "You have not visited so often this week," he observed one afternoon, as she settled a shawl around his shoulders against the autumn chill. "Is something troubling you, child?" Eleanor considered denying it, and found, as she so often did with him, that she had not the heart to lie. "There is a gentleman," she admitted, "an earl newly come to the county. My mother wishes him to marry my sister, and I believe he will, for it would be the sensible arrangement, and sensible arrangements are what men of consequence generally choose. And yet you speak of it as though it grieves you. It is foolish. I have known him a matter of weeks. I have no claim upon his attention, nor any reasonable expectation of it. The heart," the old man said gently, "has never once in the history of the world consulted reason before forming an attachment. You would do well not to expect it to begin with yours." He studied her with those pale, still recovering eyes, and something in his expression grew thoughtful, almost searching. "This Earl. What is his name?" "Ravenscliff. Julian Hartley, Earl of Ravenscliff." She would remember, later, the way the old man went utterly still, the colour draining from his weathered face, his hands gripping the arms of the chair as though the ground beneath him had shifted. But in that moment, absorbed in her own quiet unhappiness, she noticed only that he had grown quiet, and attributed it, wrongly, to weariness. "Are you unwell?" she asked, moving quickly to his side. "I am," his voice caught. "I am well enough. Only tired, child, the name startled an old memory loose, that is all." She did not press him. She did not know, that afternoon, what a catastrophic and beautiful truth she had just spoken aloud without any understanding of its weight. The weeks that followed brought Julian Hartley to Ashworth House with a regularity that set the whole county talking. He called upon pretence of business with Sir Edmund regarding a shared boundary dispute. He called to return a book he claimed Lavinia had lent him, though Eleanor privately doubted her sister had ever opened a book by choice in her life. He called, increasingly, without any pretence at all. And though Lady Ashworth arranged every visit to showcase Lavinia at her most radiant, Eleanor could not fail to notice, nor, increasingly, could Lavinia, that the Earl's attention kept drifting, again and again, toward the quiet corner where Eleanor sat with her needlework or her father's ledgers. "He asked me today," Lavinia said one evening, with a petulance that sat oddly on her usually serene features, whether you had always possessed such a talent for figures, or whether it was something you had cultivated out of necessity. I did not know what to say. Why should an earl care one way or another about your talent for figures, Eleanor? I am certain it means nothing, Eleanor said, though her pulse had quickened at the report. Perhaps he was merely making conversation. He does not make conversation with me about figures, Lavinia said, and there was something in her voice, not quite accusation, not quite hurt, but some uncomfortable blend of both, that made Eleanor look up sharply from her mending. For the first time in longer than she could remember, her beautiful, favoured sister was looking at her not with the careless affection of someone who had never had cause to consider Eleanor a rival, but with the wary, wounded confusion of someone who was beginning to suspect she might be losing something she had always assumed was hers by right. It was a small thing, that look, but it was the first thread in a tapestry that would, within weeks, unravel the whole careful order of the Ashworth household. The reversal, when it came, arrived at the county assembly ball in late autumn, in front of nearly every family of consequence in Hartwell and its surrounding parishes. Eleanor had not wished to attend. She had, in fact, argued rather forcefully with her mother that her presence was unnecessary, that she would be far more usefully employed reviewing the household accounts, that the assembly hall would be crowded and warm and full of exactly the kind of polite, glittering cruelty she had spent a lifetime learning to endure by simply making herself small enough to escape notice. But Lady Ashworth, sensing that the Earl's continued interest, whatever its confusing shape, required Eleanor's presence to properly manage, had insisted, and so Eleanor found herself once again standing at the edge of a ballroom in her plainest gown, watching her sister glow beneath the chandeliers. The Earl arrived late and made his way, with a directness that scandalized at least 3 matrons within Eleanor's immediate hearing, straight across the crowded floor to where she stood near the refreshment table. "Miss Ashworth, I had hoped to find you here, my lord." She dropped a small, wary curtsy, acutely conscious of the eyes that had turned toward them, Lavinia's among them, her lovely face gone pale and still across the room. "I confess I am surprised. I believe my sister is waiting for the next set." "I have already spoken with your sister this evening," he said, and there was something almost gentle in the way he said it, as though he understood precisely what he was risking by continuing this conversation in full view of the assembled county. "I find myself, Miss Ashworth, in want of a partner for the next dance who will not spend the duration complimenting my coat or my income." Would you do me the very great honour? The room, Eleanor was fairly certain, had gone entirely silent, though she suspected that was simply the roaring of her own pulse in her ears. "My lord, I do not think it wise. I have found," he said quietly, "that wisdom and happiness are not always the same pursuit, Miss Ashworth. I am asking you to dance with me, not out of pity and not out of obligation to your family, but because in 3 months of tedious, glittering evenings in this county, you are the only person who has said a single true thing to me, and I find I would very much like to hear more of them." She should have refused. Every instinct, born of 24 years of careful invisibility, told her to refuse, to protect herself from the inevitable humiliation of being publicly, spectacularly wrong about what this man's attention could possibly mean. But something braver than instinct, something that had been slowly, quietly growing in her since a rain-soaked night beneath a bent oak tree, rose up instead, and she placed her hand in his. The dance that followed would be spoken of in Hartwell drawing-rooms for months afterward, not because it was scandalous, though Lady Ashworth's expression suggested she found it precisely so, but because of the way the Earl of Ravenscliff, a man renowned throughout the county for his cool reserve, looked at Eleanor Ashworth as though the rest of the ballroom had ceased to exist. "You are frightened," he observed, midway through the set, his voice pitched low enough for her ears alone. "I am uncertain," Eleanor corrected, "which particular disaster I am meant to be frightened of. There are several competing candidates." That surprised a genuine laugh from him, a rare, unguarded sound that turned several more heads in their direction. "Name one, and I will endeavour to address it directly." "My family expects you to marry my sister." "Your family," he said with careful precision, "has expected a great many things of me that I have no intention of providing. I did not come to this county to marry according to anyone's expectations, Miss Ashworth. I came because my estate required my presence, and I have remained rather longer than strictly necessary because I discovered, quite against my own expectations, a woman who speaks to me as though I am a man and not merely a title attached to a fortune." His grey eyes held hers, steady and unflinching. "I find that I am no longer willing to pretend I do not notice her." Eleanor's breath caught, and for one suspended, glittering moment, standing in the candlelight with his hand warm against hers, she allowed herself to believe entirely in the impossible. It was Lavinia's stricken face across the ballroom, and her mother's white, furious one beside it, that reminded her precisely how much that belief was about to cost. The carriage ride home was conducted in a silence so absolute it felt like its own kind of violence. It was not until they reached Ashworth House and the drawing-room door had closed behind them that Lady Ashworth's composure finally broke. "Do you have any conception," she said, her voice shaking with a fury Eleanor had rarely seen directed so fully at her, "of what you have done tonight? Do you understand what is at stake for this family, for your father, for your sister, for every one of us? I danced one dance. Mother, you humiliated your sister in front of the entire county. You made a spectacle of yourself with a man who is meant to be courting Lavinia. And you did it, I have no doubt, quite deliberately, because you have never once in your life been able to bear watching her have something you did not. The unfairness of it struck Eleanor like a physical blow. "That is not true," she said, her own voice rising now, 24 years of careful, dutiful silence finally cracking. "I have spent my entire life stepping aside for Lavinia. I have managed this household, nursed the tenants, kept the accounts that kept us from ruin, and asked nothing in return except to occasionally be seen as something more than useful. I did not seek the Earl's attention, Mother. I have done nothing tonight but fail, for once, to refuse it." "Then you will refuse it now," Lady Ashworth said, with a cold finality that left no room for argument. "You will write to him. You will explain that your behaviour tonight was an unfortunate lapse, and that his attentions rightly belong with your sister. And you will do it before this family's last remaining chance at solvency is destroyed by your selfishness." Lavinia, who had said nothing throughout the exchange, finally spoke, her voice small and unsteady in a way Eleanor had rarely heard from her confident, golden sister. "Is it selfish, Eleanor, to want, just once, to be chosen?" The question landed with devastating precision, because it was, Eleanor understood in that moment, exactly what Lavinia herself had spent her whole life wanting to. Not admiration, which she had always possessed in abundance, but genuine, unguarded choosing, the kind Eleanor had just glimpsed, and could not now bring herself to surrender. "No," Eleanor said quietly, "it is not selfish. But I cannot manufacture the Earl's regard for you, Lavinia, any more than I can extinguish whatever regard he has shown for me. I am sorry. I am truly sorry that this hurts you, but I will not write that letter." She left the room before her mother could respond, climbed the stairs to her small chamber, and sat for a long while in the dark, her heart a confused tangle of guilt and something that felt terrifyingly like hope. She did not know that the old man in the gardener's cottage had spent that same evening in a private turmoil of his own, for that afternoon. Unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, he had finally asked the question he had been circling for weeks, and Eleanor, distracted by preparations for the assembly, had answered it without thinking. Ravenscliff, he had murmured, when she mentioned in passing that the Earl might call again soon. "Tell me, child, does he favour his left hand? When he writes, is there a small scar above his right brow, from a boyhood fall from a chestnut tree?" Eleanor had laughed, thinking it an old man's rambling curiosity. "I could not say, sir. I have not studied him so closely as that." But the old man had gone very quiet afterward, his weathered hands trembling around his teacup, and that night, alone in the cottage, he had wept for the first time since Eleanor had found him, not from grief, but from a hope so enormous and so long forbidden that he scarcely knew how to hold it. The days that followed the assembly ball brought a chill to Ashworth House that had nothing to do with the season. Lady Ashworth spoke to Eleanor only when necessity demanded it, her displeasure worn like a second gown. Lavinia, wounded and confused, alternated between cool distance and moments of raw, unguarded hurt that made Eleanor's guilt sit like a stone in her chest, even as she could not bring herself to regret the truth of what had passed between herself and the Earl. Only Sir Edmund, distracted by his own mounting anxieties, seemed to notice nothing amiss at all, though Eleanor suspected this was less obliviousness than a father's simple exhaustion, a man too weighed down by his own failures to carry his daughters as well. Through it all, Eleanor continued her secret visits to the gardener's cottage, finding in the old man's quiet company a refuge from the tension that had settled over the rest of her life. He seemed, in those days, both stronger and stranger than before. His colour improved, his appetite returned, but his eyes had taken on a watchful, waiting quality she could not quite account for, as though he were holding his breath for some event he alone could see approaching. "You are troubled," he said on one of these visits, as she settled a fresh loaf and a jar of preserves onto the small table. "More than usual." "My family believes I have ruined everything," Eleanor admitted, "by allowing myself to hope for something I have no right to hope for." "And what is it you hope for, precisely?" She considered lying, or deflecting, as she had grown so practiced at doing. Instead, for reasons she could not fully articulate, she found herself telling him everything: the dance, the Earl's words, her mother's fury, Lavinia's quiet devastation, the terrible, wonderful confusion of being wanted for the first time in her life by someone whose wanting she had never dared to imagine. The old man listened without interrupting, his expression growing more tender, more sorrowful, and more strangely joyful all at once, until Eleanor finally fell silent, uncertain what to make of his silence. "Child," he said at last, his voice unsteady, "I must ask you something, and I must ask you to answer honestly, however strange the question may seem. When you next see this Earl, when you are quite certain no one else is near, will you tell him a name for me? Will you tell him that a man who once loved a great house full of laughter, and a wife whose portrait still hangs, I am certain, in the West Gallery, and a son he taught to ride a grey pony named Comet the summer the boy turned 6, will you tell him that such a man asks, humbly, whether he might still be forgiven?" Eleanor stared at him, understanding dawning slowly, disbelievingly, through her. "Sir, are you telling me?" "I am telling you," the old man said, tears finally spilling freely down his weathered face, "that you have spent 3 months nursing the Earl of Ravenscliff's father back from the very edge of death, without either of us understanding what Providence had arranged, and that I have not had the courage, until this moment, to say it aloud, for fear that speaking it would somehow make the hope of it too fragile to survive." For a long moment, Eleanor could not speak at all. The pieces fell together with a force that stole her breath. The old man's strange stillness at the mention of Ravenscliff's name, the fragmented stories of a lost son, the fine hands beneath the ragged coat, the education in his voice that had never quite matched his circumstances. She had been so absorbed in her own quiet joy and quieter guilt that she had failed entirely to see the truth sitting patiently before her for weeks. "Your name," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "Your true name." "Charles Hartley," the old man said, "once the Earl of Ravenscliff, before I surrendered the title in every way but law to my son, and disappeared into the world to punish myself for sins that I have come slowly to understand these past weeks, Thanks entirely to your kindness, I did not deserve to carry so completely alone." Eleanor sank into the chair beside him, her mind reeling with the enormity of it. The old man she had nursed in secret, fed from her own family's meagre stores, comforted through fevered nights, was not merely a forgotten stranger, but the father of the man who had, against every sensible expectation, chosen to look at her as though she mattered. "He believes you dead," she said slowly. "He has mourned you for 10 years. I know." Charles Hartley's voice broke on the words, and I do not know how to walk back into his life and ask him to forgive a decade of grief I inflicted upon him out of my own cowardice. But I know that I cannot continue hiding, not now, not when Providence has so plainly arranged for the very woman my son has come to love to be the one who found me in the road and refused to let me die there unremembered. Eleanor's cheeks warmed despite the gravity of the moment. "He has not said he loves me, sir. He has not needed to," Charles said, with the ghost of a smile breaking through his tears. "I have known that boy's heart since before he could walk. I recognize its workings even at this distance, and through you, and through the way you speak of him even now, without meaning to. The revelation should have brought Eleanor nothing but joy, and in its purest form, beneath all the complication, it did. But joy, she was learning, rarely arrived alone in a life like hers, and even as her heart soared at the impossible knot of fate that had brought her to this cottage, this old man, this truth, a colder, more practical fear settled beside it, the fear of how such news, once loosed into the world, might be twisted by those around her into something other than the simple, honest kindness it had been. She did not yet know how prophetic that fear would prove. News in a county the size of Hartwell has a way of finding its own current regardless of how carefully one tries to dam it, and it was scarcely 3 days after Charles Hartley's revelation that the current found its way, disastrously, to Lady Ashworth's ears. It happened through no fault of Eleanor's discretion. The cottage's isolation, which had served so well to hide a sick stranger, could not conceal the sudden, unmistakable appearance of a physician's carriage, for Charles, in his eagerness to finally reveal himself properly, had insisted on being examined by a proper doctor to confirm he was fit to face his son, and old Dr. Mercer, once he laid eyes on the patient's face beneath its unkempt beard, had gone pale as chalk and declared, in a voice that carried rather further than intended, that he would swear before any magistrate in England that he was looking upon the long-vanished Earl of Ravenscliff. By nightfall, half of Hartwell knew. By the following morning, Lady Ashworth knew, and stormed down the overgrown path to the gardener's cottage with a fury that eclipsed anything Eleanor had yet witnessed from her. "You have been harbouring a strange man on this property for months," her mother said, her voice shaking with a combination of outrage and, Eleanor slowly realized, something calculating beneath the anger. "And you did not think to inform your own family?" "I did not know who he was, mother, not until 3 days past, and I would ask that you lower your voice, for he has been gravely ill and does not need further distress." But Lady Ashworth was no longer listening. She was staring at Charles Hartley, thin, weathered, but undeniably once cleaned and properly dressed, bearing the unmistakable bones of aristocratic breeding, with an expression that shifted even as Eleanor watched, from outrage to a kind of hungry, calculating delight. "The Earl's father," she breathed, "alive and found on our land, nursed by an Ashworth." She turned to Eleanor with a suddenness that was almost dizzying, her fury evaporating into something far more dangerous. "Eleanor, my dear girl, why did you not tell me sooner? This changes everything. Everything. I do not understand your meaning, mother. Do you not see the opportunity before us?" Lady Ashworth's eyes had taken on a bright, feverish quality. "The Earl will be beside himself with gratitude toward whoever restored his father to him. If it is properly managed, if the story is told correctly, this could secure Lavinia's match beyond any doubt. We need only ensure the Earl understands that it was the family's collective care that saved his father, that Lavinia herself played a central role in his nursing. Lavinia has never once set foot in this cottage," Eleanor said, cold dread pooling in her stomach as she understood, with sickening clarity, precisely what her mother was proposing. "Details," Lady Ashworth said dismissively. "The Earl need not know every detail. What matters is the impression, Eleanor, and the impression that will secure this family's future is that the Ashworth women, together, restored his father to him. You will say nothing to contradict this. Do you understand me? After everything I have sacrificed for this family, you will not be the one to ruin our final chance at security over something so trivial as who precisely carried the broth." Eleanor looked past her mother to where Charles sat, his weathered face creased with distress at overhearing a scheme built upon erasing the very kindness that had saved his life, and something hardened in her that had never quite hardened before. "I will not lie to him, mother," she said quietly, but with a steel that made Lady Ashworth blink in surprise. "Not about this. Not about anything. Then you will watch your sister's future and your father's solvency crumble because of your stubborn pride," Lady Ashworth snapped, and swept from the cottage in a fury that promised the matter was far from settled. Charles reached for Eleanor's hand once they were alone, his grip trembling but sincere. "I am sorry, child. I did not intend for my return to bring such trouble upon you." "It is not your doing, sir," Eleanor said, though her voice wavered. "It is only that I have spent my whole life being told my worth lies in what I can quietly provide, and never in what I might openly deserve. I find, rather to my own surprise, that I am tired of it." "Then do not let them take this from you," Charles said, his pale eyes fierce with a father's protective love, extended now to a woman who was not yet his daughter, but whom he had already, in his heart, begun to claim as one. "Whatever comes, Eleanor, whatever my son learns, and however it is told to him, you will tell him the truth yourself, and you will let the truth stand on its own merit. I owe you that much, and considerably more besides." The confrontation Eleanor had been dreading arrived 2 days later, and it did not unfold as her mother had planned. Julian Hartley arrived at Ashworth House not through the front door, with its careful formality, but striding across the lawn directly from the direction of the old chapel road, his face white with an emotion Eleanor had never before seen him wear. Not the cool reserve of their earlier meetings, but something raw and unguarded and barely controlled. "Miss Ashworth," his voice shook, "I have just come from the cottage." "Doctor," Mercer sent word. I could not credit it. I rode the whole way certain it must be some cruel mistake, and yet he stopped, visibly struggling to master himself. "It is true. It is truly my father. Alive after 10 years. Alive and cared for, I am told, by your family." Eleanor's heart clenched at the phrase, "by your family," not by you specifically, and she understood with a sinking clarity that her mother's version of events had already reached him before her own could. "My lord, I must tell you the truth of the matter myself. Before, your mother has already told me a great deal," Julian said, and something in his tone made Eleanor's stomach drop. "She tells me your entire family conspired together to nurse my father back to health, that it was a joint act of Christian charity performed in secret out of modesty rather than any desire for recognition. She tells me, in particular, of your sister Lavinia's tenderness in the sick room." He watched Eleanor's face carefully as he said it, and she saw, with a jolt, that he was testing her, waiting to see whether she would allow the lie to stand. "That is not true," Eleanor said immediately, without hesitation, though her pulse hammered with the risk of contradicting her own mother so plainly. "My lord, I found your father alone on the chapel road, feverish and abandoned, and I alone have cared for him these 3 months past, in secret, because I feared my family's reaction to harboring a stranger on our land. Lavinia has never once visited that cottage. Whatever my mother has told you, I will not permit a lie, however small, to stand between us, not about this, and not about anything else." The relief that broke across Julian's face was so profound, so immediate, that it took Eleanor's breath away. "I knew it," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "The moment your mother began speaking of it, I knew the story did not fit the woman I had come to know. You have never once, in all our conversations, sought credit for anything, Miss Ashworth, not for the accounts you keep, not for the tenants you nurse, not for a single one of the countless small kindnesses I have watched you perform without any expectation of praise. I should have trusted that instinct from the first word out of her ladyship's mouth. You are not angry that I concealed him from my own family? Angry?" Julian's laugh was unsteady, half a sob. "Eleanor, may I call you Eleanor? You found my father dying at the side of a road, and rather than passing him by as a stranger's misfortune, as nearly anyone else in this county would have done, you carried him to shelter and nursed him back to life with your own hands, at considerable personal risk to your own reputation, expecting nothing in return. I have spent 10 years believing him dead. I have spent 10 years grieving a man I never had the chance to properly forgive, or to be forgiven by in turn. You have given me back not merely a father, but the possibility of peace I had long since surrendered any hope of finding." His grey eyes, bright with tears he made no effort to hide, held hers with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. "I do not have words sufficient to the gratitude I owe you. I am not entirely certain gratitude is even the correct word for what I feel. "My lord, Julian," he corrected softly. "I think, after everything, you have earned the right to my given name." Julian, the name felt strange and wonderful in her mouth. I did not do it for gratitude, or for reward, or for any thought of what it might mean beyond a stranger's suffering ended. I would ask that you understand that clearly, whatever comes next. "I understand it entirely," Julian said. "It is in fact precisely why what I feel for you has grown into something considerably beyond gratitude these past months, long before I understood the connection between you and my father existed at all." He took a step closer, close enough that Eleanor could see the fine tremor still in his hands, the barely restrained emotion in every line of his face. "I have watched you across drawing rooms and ballrooms, Eleanor, quietly managing every crisis your family could not manage themselves, quietly caring for people who never thought to ask how you were faring in return. And I have thought, more times than I can count, that I have never in my life met anyone of such unassuming, unshakable goodness. That is not gratitude speaking. That is a truth I have been circling for weeks and have not yet found the courage to say plainly." Eleanor's eyes filled, unbidden, with tears of her own. "I do not know how to be looked at this way," she admitted, her voice breaking on the confession. "I have spent my whole life being useful, Julian, and I do not know how to trust that being wanted is not simply another kind of usefulness in disguise." "Then let me spend however long it takes," Julian said softly, "proving to you that it is not the same thing at all. It should have been, in that moment, a perfect and unclouded happiness, and for the space of several suspended, glowing minutes, it very nearly was. But happiness of the sort Eleanor had never before been permitted rarely arrived. She was learning, without one final trial demanding to be paid. That trial arrived that same evening, in the form of Lavinia, standing in the doorway of Eleanor's chamber, with an expression that held none of the wounded petulance Eleanor had braced herself for, and all of something far more complicated: grief and a kind of dawning, painful self-recognition. "Mother told him the lie," Lavinia said quietly, without preamble. "I knew she meant to. I let her, because I wanted so badly for it to be true, for some part of your goodness to be mine as well, for once, without having to earn it the difficult way you always have." Eleanor set down her hairbrush, startled by the raw honesty in her sister's voice. "Lavinia, I have spent my whole life being told I am the fortunate one," Lavinia continued, moving into the room and sitting heavily upon the edge of Eleanor's bed, "and I have believed it, because it was easier than examining what that fortune actually cost. It cost you, Eleanor, every kindness you were never thanked for, every burden you carried, so that I might be free to simply be admired. I benefited from all of it, and I never once thought to ask whether it was fair." Her lovely face crumpled. "I am ashamed, sister, not merely of tonight's lie, though I am ashamed of that too. I am ashamed of 11 years of taking your invisibility for granted as the natural order of things, when it was never natural at all. It was simply what our family found convenient." Eleanor crossed the room and sat beside her sister, taking her hand, a gesture of comfort she had offered countless times before, to tenants and servants and her own ailing mother, but never, she realized with a small ache, to Lavinia, because Lavinia had never before seemed to need it. "I do not want your shame," Eleanor said gently. "I want, if anything is to change between us, only your honesty, freely given, the way you have just given it now." "You have it," Lavinia said, tears spilling freely. "And Eleanor, I want you to know, whatever Mother schemes, whatever she says to the Earl or to anyone else, I will not stand beside a lie that steals your happiness to purchase mine. You have earned this, sister, more than earned it. I only wish I had understood that sooner, and told you so more often." It was, Eleanor thought later, one of the most unexpected gifts of the entire strange, upended season. Not the Earl's regard, precious as that was, but this, her sister's genuine, unguarded love, offered freely for perhaps the first time in either of their lives, without the weight of comparison or competition standing between them. Lady Ashworth's scheme, deprived of Lavinia's cooperation and Eleanor's silence both, collapsed within the week, though not without one final, painful confrontation in which her ladyship accused Eleanor of selfishness, of ingratitude, of choosing her own happiness over her family's survival, accusations that stung precisely because Eleanor had spent so long believing some version of them herself. It was Charles Hartley, restored now to something resembling his former dignity, cleaned and properly dressed, and installed in the finest guest chamber Ravenscliff Park could offer, who finally settled the matter, arriving at Ashworth House with his son beside him to speak with Sir Edmund directly. "Your daughter saved my life," Charles said, with the quiet authority of a man who had, whatever his years of self-imposed exile, never entirely lost the bearing of an earl. She did so expecting nothing, at considerable risk to herself, out of nothing more than the plain goodness of her character. I will not stand by and watch that goodness punished by a scheme built on stealing credit that was never hers to give away. If this family requires assistance to settle its debts, I am prepared to offer it, not as payment for a lie, but as gratitude for a truth. But I will not permit that gratitude to be misdirected toward anyone but the woman who earned it." Sir Edmund, who had listened to the whole affair with the particular helplessness of a man too long avoidant of his own household's conflicts, finally found his voice. "Eleanor has never asked for anything from this family," he said, with something that might have been genuine shame, except perhaps to be seen as more than useful. "I have failed to give her even that small mercy for a great many years. I will not fail her further now." It was not, Eleanor thought, watching her father speak with more conviction than she had heard from him in a decade, a perfect reconciliation. Lady Ashworth's pride would take longer than a single conversation to soften, and some wounds, she suspected, would never entirely heal. But it was a beginning, and beginnings, she had learned across 3 strange transformative months, were sometimes the most anyone could reasonably ask of a difficult world. The wedding, when it came the following spring, was held not in the grand cathedral in town that Lady Ashworth had initially insisted upon, but in the small stone chapel at the fork of the old chapel road, the very spot, though few beyond the immediate family understood the significance, where Eleanor had first found a dying stranger beneath a bent oak tree and chosen kindness over caution. The chapel had been transformed for the occasion, its worn stone walls softened with garlands of white roses and late blooming jasmine, candles glowing warm against the afternoon light that spilled through the narrow windows. It was smaller and plainer than any venue befitting an earl's wedding ought to be, and it was, by unanimous and quiet agreement between Eleanor and Julian, exactly right. Lavinia stood as her sister's attendant, her earlier jealousy long since transformed into a fierce, protective joy that surprised everyone who had known the sisters only by their old, careless dynamic. She had, in the months between the revelation and the wedding, begun quietly courting the attentions of a widowed baronet in the next county, a kind, unremarkable man who valued her not for the beauty the county had always praised, but for a warmth and generosity she had only recently begun to discover in herself. Once she was no longer measuring her worth against a sister she had finally, truly come to know, but it was Charles Hartley who provided the moment that no one present would ever forget. For it had been decided, in the weeks of planning, that Sir Edmund would walk Eleanor down the short aisle, as tradition demanded of a father. But when the appointed moment arrived, and the small gathered assembly rose to their feet, it was not Sir Edmund alone who appeared in the chapel doorway beside Eleanor. Charles Hartley stood on her other side, offering his arm alongside her father's, dressed now in the fine dark coat of an earl restored fully to his rightful place, his weathered face transformed by an emotion so pure and so complete that several among the gathered guests found themselves quietly weeping before Eleanor had taken a single step. "I have no right to claim this honour," he had said to her privately the evening before, his voice unsteady with the asking. "You are not yet my daughter, and I have done nothing to earn a father's place at your side. But I have thought these past months of what it would mean to walk beside the woman who found me broken on a roadside and chose, against every reasonable instinct, to see a man worth saving rather than a burden to step around. I have thought that perhaps, if you would permit it, I might walk beside your father today, and beside you fully as a father tomorrow, and for every day that follows, for as long as you will have me in that role." Eleanor, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat, had simply taken his weathered hand in both of hers, and that had been answer enough. And so it was that Eleanor Ashworth walked the short aisle of the little stone chapel, flanked by two fathers, one by blood, awkward and quietly proud, learning at last how to properly cherish a daughter he had too long taken for granted, and one by choice, restored to life by her own hands, offering in return a devotion that would prove, in all the years that followed, as steady and unshakable as anything Eleanor had ever known. Julian waited for her at the altar, and Eleanor would remember, for the rest of her long and happy life, the particular quality of his expression as she came toward him, not the cool, guarded reserve the county had once believed was his only face, but something entirely open, entirely undefended, the face of a man who had spent a decade grieving a father he thought lost, and a lifetime believing himself unlikely to be truly known by anyone at all, until a plain, overlooked, endlessly kind woman had walked into his life and quietly, without ever seeking to, taught him otherwise. "You once told me," he murmured, as she reached his side, low enough that only she could hear it, that numbers do not flatter or deceive, that they simply are what they are, and that one may build something solid upon that certainty. I have thought of that a great deal these past months, Eleanor. I find that you are the most certain, solid, truest thing I have ever built a hope upon. I do not intend to spend the rest of my life taking that certainty for granted, nor I yours, Eleanor whispered back, and if her voice trembled, it trembled with a joy so complete it left no room for the old fear that had shadowed her for so many invisible years. They were married as the late afternoon light turned gold through the chapel's narrow windows, and when Julian finally, gently, lifted her veil to kiss her before the small assembly of family, both old and newly claimed, Charles Hartley wept openly and without shame, and Lavinia gripped Sir Edmund's hand so tightly he later swore she had very nearly broken it, and even Lady Ashworth, watching her once overlooked daughter radiant and beloved at the centre of a joy no scheme of hers could have manufactured, found herself weeping too, tears that carried at last something closer to genuine pride than calculation. Outside the chapel, as the wedding party emerged into the golden afternoon, the bent oak tree at the fork of the chapel road stood as it always had, weathered and unremarkable to any eye that did not know its significance. But Eleanor paused beside it for a long moment before climbing into the carriage that would carry her to her new life at Ravenscliff Park, resting her gloved hand briefly against its old, familiar bark. "Thank you," she murmured, to the tree, to the road, to whatever quiet providence had guided her steps home from a ball she had not wished to attend on a rain-soaked night that had changed everything. Thank you for the man I did not know I was looking for, and for the family I did not know I was permitted to have. Julian, watching her from the carriage door with an expression of such tender understanding that it seemed he had somehow followed every unspoken thought behind her words, simply extended his hand. "Come home, my love," he said. "Every road from this one leads there now." And Eleanor Ashworth? No. Eleanor Hartley, Countess of Ravenscliff, a title she would wear for the rest of her days with the same quiet, unassuming grace she had once brought to a dying stranger's bedside, expecting nothing and finding, in the end, everything, took his hand and stepped into the carriage, and rode toward a happiness that the whole of Hartwell would speak of, with wonder and affection. For years to come, the story of the overlooked daughter who had once been told her only worth lay in what she could quietly give away, and who had discovered instead, through nothing more than an ordinary act of kindness toward a forgotten old man, that she had been worthy, all along, of being fully and unforgettably found.